Dog had not eaten in 4 days. That was the detail that finally made Captain Holloway pick up the phone and call someone outside the chain of command. It wasn't the incident reports. It wasn't the 3 handlers who had submitted transfer requests in the same week. It wasn't even the morning 2 weeks ago when Staff Sergeant Briggs had needed 6 stitches after attempting a routine leash-up on a dog he had handled for 8 months without incident. It was the food. 7 Belgian Malinois and 1 Dutch Shepherd, all retired, all decorated, all housed in the new transition kennel facility at Fort Kavanaugh, and one of them, the oldest, a male named Ranger with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, had simply stopped eating. The vet tech said his blood work was fine. His teeth were fine. There was nothing physically wrong with him. He had just decided, in whatever way a dog decides things, that he was done. Holloway stood in the corridor between the runs and looked at the chart in his hand without really seeing it. The noise was the thing that got to you. 8 individual storms of barking, snarling, the percussive slam of bodies against chain link, a sound that had no rhythm, no logic, only volume and fury. His new facility, which the base commander had praised in a press release 3 months ago as a model for the humane treatment of retired military working dogs, had become something closer to a controlled disaster. "They're not adjusting, sir." Sergeant First Class Denton said it flatly, without apology, standing just behind his captain's left shoulder. Denton had been in K9 for 11 years. He was not a man who dramatized. If he said it plainly, it was plain. "I've implemented every protocol from the behavioral assessment, enrichment schedule, set rotation, handler familiarization. I've had the same 2 airmen on the same shift for 6 weeks, so the dogs build association. It's not working. Define not working. Ranger won't eat. Duchess won't stop pacing. The 3 we got from the EOD unit at Bragg won't allow approach at all. We had to switch to remote-activated feeders just to get food in their runs without risking a bite incident." Denton paused. "And Kodiak broke through the interior gate 2 nights ago. 2nd time this month." Kodiak was a German Shepherd, 9 years old, 14 confirmed deployments across 2 theaters, a chest full of commendations that would have embarrassed most humans. He had served as a personal protection detail dog for 2 general officers and 1 undersecretary of defense. He was also, at this moment, the most dangerous animal on the installation, and everyone in the kennel section knew it. "Command is asking for a status update by end of week," Holloway said. Denton said nothing. They both understood what a status update by end of week meant when it came from that particular office. The facility had been designed by committee, which was its first problem. The runs were clean, climate-controlled, the right dimensions per regulation. The enrichment program had been drafted by a civilian consultant with a doctorate in animal behavior. The feeding protocols were precise. Everything about the place was correct, and nothing about it was right. These dogs had spent their careers in the kind of intimate operational bond that most people never experience with another human being, let alone an animal. They had worked in jungles, in mountains, and forward operating bases with handlers who slept beside them, who fed them by hand, who knew the sound of each dog's breathing well enough to hear when something was wrong. Now they were in individual runs in a fluorescent-lit hallway, and the handlers assigned to them changed every few weeks in rotation, and every person who approached their gates did so with a visible undercurrent of fear that the dogs could read from 40 yards away. Holloway left the facility that evening without answers. He drove home through the flat, pine-lined roads of the base, and he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold, thinking about 8 animals who had done everything that was ever asked of them and were now being asked to simply exist quietly and couldn't. His neighbor, an older man named Walt Sutton, knocked on the back door around 7. Sutton had lived in the small house next door since before Holloway's posting. He was the kind of neighbor who appeared only when he was useful, fixing a fence post before you noticed it was leaning, clearing gutters before the rain came. He was somewhere past 70, though his exact age was a matter of vague guessing. He had the compact, economical build of a man who had once been very strong and had made peace with what remained. His face was deeply lined, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to absorb more than they reflected. He worked part-time as a maintenance contractor for the chapel complex and the older administrative buildings on post, the kind of low-visibility work that filled the hours of a man who had no particular need to explain himself to anyone. Holloway had never asked what Sutton had done before. There was something in the way the man held himself, a stillness that was the opposite of vacancy, that made the question feel impolite. "You don't ask a river why it's quiet. Saw your light on late last night," Sutton said, when Holloway opened the door. He held a dish covered in foil. "Eleanor made extra cornbread. Figured you hadn't eaten." Holloway let him in, poured him coffee, and found himself talking about the kennel before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The words came out low and tired. 8 dogs. The protocols that weren't working. Ranger not eating. Kodiak breaking gates. The end-of-week status update and what it meant. Sutton listened without interrupting, which itself was unusual. Most people, when presented with a problem, started assembling solutions before you finished explaining. Sutton just sat with his coffee and listened to all of it. And when Holloway finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment. "What breed is the one that won't eat?" he asked. "Malinois. 9 years old. His handler retired out of the army last spring. Medical discharge." Sutton nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "How's he sleeping?" Holloway blinked. "I don't know. If he's sleeping light and waking up frequently, that's one thing. If he's not sleeping much at all, that's another thing." Sutton set his cup down with the careful precision of a man choosing his words at the same rate. "The eating will follow the sleeping. You fixed the sleeping, you fixed most of it. The vet cleared him physically. I'm sure she did." Sutton's tone was not dismissive. It was the tone of a man who did not doubt to the vet, and also knew there were things a vet's instruments did not measure. "Can I see them?" Holloway looked at him. "The dogs?" "In the morning, if it's convenient. I've got a job at the chapel drainage system starting at 8, but I could stop by the kennel first." He said it the way a man might offer to look at a problematic circuit breaker. Calm, practical, without drama. Holloway thought about the protocols, the liability forms, the restricted access, the fact that Kodiak had broken through an interior gate twice, and that bringing an untrained civilian into that environment was the kind of decision that generated paperwork. He thought about all of this, and then looked at the man across his kitchen table, at those quiet gray eyes, at the hands resting on the table. Large hands, calloused in patterns that had nothing to do with plumbing or carpentry, the index fingers slightly thickened, the left palm bearing a faint, old scar that ran in a diagonal line from below the thumb toward the wrist, the kind of scar you get from a dog leash under sudden, violent tension. 7 o'clock, Holloway said. Sutton arrived at 6:58. He wore his usual work clothes, canvas pants, a faded olive jacket, worn leather boots. He carried a small duffel bag over one shoulder. Denton met them at the kennel door with a skepticism he was professional enough not to voice, and the three of them walked into the corridor. The noise was, as always, immediate and total. Holloway watched Sutton's face as it hit him and saw nothing change. No wince, no hesitation. The old man walked into the sound the way you walk into weather, not ignoring it, just not altered by it. His pace was even, his shoulders unhurried, and something in that absolute lack of alarm seemed to ripple outward ahead of him like a change in air pressure. The barking did not stop, but it changed. It took Holloway a moment to understand what he was hearing. The 8 dogs had been cycling through their individual displays. Duchess pacing and snarling, Kodiak throwing himself at the gate, Ranger low and constant in the back of his run. Now, as Sutton moved slowly down the corridor, the sounds were beginning to synchronize, not quieting, but converging. 8 separate storms becoming one directed thing, all of it aimed at the old man who was walking past the gates with his hands at his sides and his eyes moving slowly from run to run. He stopped at Ranger's kennel first. The Malinois was at the back of his run, standing with his weight low, that constant low vocalization, a vibration more felt than heard. Sutton didn't approach the gate. He stood about 4 feet back and simply looked. Ranger looked at him. The sound from the other runs was still there, but somehow distant, as if the corridor had narrowed to just this exchange. Sutton began to talk. His voice was too low for Holloway to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Not commands, not soothing baby talk, something else entirely. It had the unhurried rhythm of a man reporting a situation to someone he trusted completely. He was talking to the dog the way you talk to a colleague after a hard deployment, not explaining and not reassuring, just accounting for things. Ranger's head came up a fraction. not toward Sutton, just up. A small rearrangement of posture, almost imperceptible, that meant something Holloway didn't have the vocabulary to name. Sutton reached into the side pocket of his jacket and produced a small piece of dried meat. Not a commercial treat, Holloway noticed, but something that looked homemade, dark and dense. He held it flat on his palm, pressed it gently against the chain link of the gate, and waited. Ranger didn't move for nearly a minute. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a dog who has decided something important, he walked forward. He took the food from the old man's palm without touching the fence with his teeth. He chewed it. He sat down. In 4 days, it was the first thing he had eaten. Denton made a sound behind Holloway that was not quite a word. Sutton moved on. At Duchess's Run, the Belgian female who hadn't stopped pacing in 3 weeks, he didn't offer food. He sat down on the floor of the corridor, cross-legged, with the complete unself-consciousness of a man who cared nothing for appearances, and he waited. Duchess stopped pacing. She approached the gate. She sniffed. She lay down on her side of the chain link 3 feet from where he sat, and put her head on her paws. It took 8 minutes. When Sutton reached the 3 dogs from the EOD unit, brothers in all but biology, huge and heavy-shouldered, who had not allowed a human near their gates in 6 weeks, he did something different. He stood at the midpoint between the 3 adjacent runs, his back partially to them, his body angled away, and he simply existed in their space. No approach, no food, no voice. He made himself the least threatening object in the corridor and let them come to the conclusion that he was not, in fact, a threat. One by one, they settled. The largest pressed his nose to the gate and inhaled for a long time, reading whatever information lived in this old man's skin and history. Holloway realized, standing there, that he had been holding his breath for the better part of 20 minutes. "Mr. Sutton," Denton said, his voice careful. "What language were you speaking to the first dog?" Sutton turned from the last kennel. There was nothing performative in his expression, no satisfaction, no professional pride. He looked slightly tired, the way a person looks after spending real emotional energy on something that mattered. German. Mostly. Some Dutch for the 2 from Bragg. They had German handlers before the EOD rotation. But their foundation commands were Dutch. You can feel which one they're waiting for. He paused. They're not waiting for language. They're waiting for certainty. There's a difference. Their handlers are gone, Holloway said. It came out more bluntly than he intended. I know. Sutton picked up his duffel. So is everyone's eventually. That's not the problem. He looked at Holloway directly for a moment with those level gray eyes. The problem is they don't have a reason to wake up in the morning. And you can't prescribe that. You have to give it to them. He asked then if he could come back the following morning. And the morning after, Holloway said yes without thinking about the paperwork. Over the next 2 weeks, Sutton arrived each day before his chapel maintenance work. He had a routine that was entirely his own and that borrowed nothing from the behavioral protocols on Holloway's clipboard. He brought different fruits each day. Not randomly, but calibrated, Holloway slowly realized, to each dog's history. The EOD dogs got high-value protein, the kind of reward used in explosive detection work. Duchess got something lower-key, appropriate for a protection animal who had learned to be suspicious of sudden reward. Ranger got the homemade dried meat, and it was never the same twice, as if Sutton understood that the dog needed variety to feel that the world was still offering him something new. He never raised his voice. He never used praise that sounded like performance. When a dog did something well, Sutton acknowledged it the way a senior NCO acknowledges good work, briefly, specifically, without fanfare, which somehow meant more than effusion. On the 5th day, he opened Ranger's gate. Holloway's hand moved toward the radio and then stopped. Denton had gone completely still. The Malinois stepped out of the run and sat at Sutton's left side with the automatic precision of long training, his shoulder pressed against the old man's knee, his eyes forward. Sutton looked down at him for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the dog's head, and said nothing. They stood like that for perhaps 30 seconds, the 2 of them, something passing between them that Holloway didn't know how to categorize. By the end of the 2nd week, Sutton had all 8 dogs out in the exercise yard, moving together without conflict. He walked them himself for the first hour. 8 leashes in 2 hands, the dogs in loose formation. His body language carrying a kind of unspoken architectural authority. Not dominance, not control. Something quieter and more permanent. Belonging. He was telling them, through every degree of his posture and every rhythm of his breathing, that the pack was whole again. That someone reliable was here. Then he did the thing that Holloway did not expect. He stopped in the middle of the yard and turned to face Holloway and Denton and the 2 young handlers who had been watching from the fence line. "Come in," he said. Denton went first, because Denton was Denton. He came through the gate with the careful movements of a man who had been handling dogs for 11 years and still had enough respect for these particular animals to move deliberately. Sutton handed him 2 leashes, Kodiak and the larger of the EOD dogs, and spoke quietly about each one. Kodiak led with his left shoulder. Give him half a step of lead and he'd find his own pace. The EOD dog needed to walk slightly behind, not at heel. His training was detection, not protection, and walking parallel to a person felt to him like being crowded. Denton listened, adjusted, walked. Both dogs moved with him. Then Sutton turned to Holloway. Holloway was a cavalry officer who had pivoted into kennel administration through a combination of institutional need and the kind of career trajectory that doesn't always follow desire. He had never handled a working dog. He had managed programs, written protocols, reviewed assessments. He had never once held a leash connected to a living animal that outweighed his professional comfort by about 40 pounds of operational conditioning. Sutton handed him Ranger's leash without preamble. "He'll test you in the first 30 seconds, Sutton said quietly, not aggressively. He'll slow down to see if you slow down with him. Don't. Not yet. Walk like you know where you're going, even if you don't. He doesn't need you to be certain about the destination. He needs you to be certain about the movement." He paused. "And your grip, loosen it. You're strangling the line. The leash is information, not control. Feel what he's telling you." Holloway walked. Ranger slowed. Holloway kept his pace. Ranger came back up alongside him, and in that rejoining there was something that felt almost like conversation, 2 parties establishing terms. Holloway felt his own breathing change, settle, slow to match something he was receiving through the leather in his palm. He didn't know if he imagined it. He didn't think he imagined it. He walked to the far fence and back, and when he returned, Sutton was watching him with an expression that was the closest thing to approval the old man seemed to traffic in. "Better," Sutton said. The same single word, and moved on to hand a leash to one of the young handlers, speaking to her with the same patient specificity. Within an hour, every dog was in the yard, each paired with a person, each moving with a purposeful quiet that bore no resemblance to the fractured pandemonium of 2 weeks prior. The young handler who had been most afraid, a kid named Perez, 22 years old, who had requested a transfer twice, was walking Duchess along the fence line with her back straight and something new in her face that Holloway took a moment to identify. It was pride. Not pride in being observed, but the private kind. The kind that comes from having done a thing you believed you couldn't do. Sutton had not just quieted 8 dogs, he had handed 8 frightened people a version of themselves they hadn't met yet. On the 14th day, Holloway arrived at the kennel before dawn and found Sutton already there. The old man was sitting on an upturned bucket outside Ranger's Run, the dog pressed against the inside of the gate. And the 2 of them were doing the thing that had become their morning ritual, existing quietly together while the early light came through the high clerestory windows and the rest of the base was still asleep. Holloway poured coffee from his thermos and handed a cup over the gate and sat down on the bench across the corridor. They didn't speak for a while. "I put your name in for a visitor access credential," Holloway said finally. "Permanent." Base commander approved it. Sutton accepted this with a nod. "Appreciate it. I also ran your name through the system," Holloway said. A pause. Not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that contains an understood acknowledgement. "Didn't find much," Holloway continued. "A contractor license, current. A lease agreement in your name going back 11 years. A truck registration." He paused. "No military service record. No federal employment history." Sutton sipped his coffee. "I mentioned it to a friend of mine at the intelligence center," Holloway said. "He ran a parallel check. He found a reference. Not a record. Just a reference. In a 1987 document that's been mostly redacted. A joint interagency K-9 program. Something that operated outside the conventional MWD structure. He looked at the old man. It had a nickname. The Quiet Dogs. Sutton looked at the floor of the corridor for a moment. Ranger, on his side of the gate, put his nose to the gap at the bottom and inhaled slowly. They were good programs, Sutton said at last. Good dogs. Good people. He said it in the tone a man uses for things that are finished and that he has already mourned, completely and privately, and does not intend to unmoor again. We operated in places where noise would get you killed. So you learn to work in silence. The dogs learned it too. It changes you, working that way. He glanced at Ranger. Never entirely goes away. How long? Long enough. He handed the coffee cup back. I have a drainage job at the chapel annex this morning. Probably run until noon. He stood, moving with the economical care of a man whose joints had accumulated opinion over decades. The two from EOD. They're ready to start scent work again. They don't need much, just something with low stakes that lets them use what they know. Denton has the right instincts. He just doesn't trust them yet. Tell him to trust them. He picked up his duffel and his toolbox and walked toward the door, his work boots quiet on the concrete. Mr. Sutton, Holloway called after him. The old man stopped, but didn't turn. Why did you come back? Every day. You got work. You didn't have to. Sutton was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first birds had started up in the trees beyond the fence line. Ranger shifted in his run, settling his weight. I spent 30 years asking a lot from dogs, Sutton said to the door. More than was fair, some of it. They never told you when it cost them. That was part of their character. He paused. I can fix drainage. I can fix a lot of things, but I can't fix that. So I show up when there's somewhere I can be useful. He pushed through the door into the gray morning light. They kept showing up for me. Seems like the least I can do. The door closed. Holloway sat in the quiet corridor. The sounds of the kennel around him entirely changed. Not absent, not silent, but calm. The ordinary purposeful sounds of 8 animals living in the present tense. He looked at Ranger, who had turned from the gate and was walking in a slow circle at the back of his run. The movement not anxious, but contemplative. The way a dog moves when it is thinking about lying down. Which he did. He turned twice, settled, put his head on his paws, and closed his eyes. Holloway realized it was the first time he had seen the dog sleep. 3 months later, a colonel from Forces Command came through on an inspection. She had seen the initial incident reports, the bite incidents, the transfer requests, the gate breaches, and she wanted to understand what had turned the numbers around. Holloway walked her through the facility. The dogs were exercised, alert, visibly well. Duchess was in the middle of a scent detection rotation with Perez, who had withdrawn both transfer requests. Kodiak was running a search pattern in the exercise yard with Denton, precise and focused, a dog doing the work he had been built for. Your behavioral intervention program, the colonel said, reviewing her tablet. I'm seeing a 2-week implementation period with significant outcome improvement. What protocol did you use? Holloway thought about how to answer. He could tell her about the protocols, the new enrichment schedule, the consistent handler assignments, the scent work reintroduction, all of which were real and documented and defensible. He could tell her about metrics and outcomes and the kind of language that looked good in command briefings. We stopped treating them like a problem to be solved, he said instead. We started treating them like veterans who needed a reason to get up in the morning. Turns out the approach isn't that different from how you treat a person. The colonel looked up from her tablet. We had some outside consultation, Holloway added carefully. From whom? He thought of an old man sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor, while a damaged dog decided whether to trust him. He thought of hands that held a leash the way most people hold a handshake, with their full attention. He thought of Ranger sleeping in the morning light. A neighbor, he said. Someone with experience. The colonel raised an eyebrow but let it go. She was a practical woman. Results were results. That evening, Holloway stopped at Sutton's house on his way home. The old man was on the porch, reading, a glass of water on the rail beside him. Holloway told him about the inspection, the colonel's questions, the outcome. Sutton listened, set down his book. She asked about the dog specifically? Asked why Kodiak's gate breach incidents dropped to 0. What did you tell her? That he had a job again. Sutton looked satisfied in the way of a man for whom satisfaction is a quiet thing. That's it, he said. That's the whole answer. He picked up his book again. How's Ranger eating? Everything we put in front of him, Holloway said. Denton says he's going to get fat. Sutton made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh Holloway had heard from him. Good, he said. He's earned it. Holloway walked back to his house as the last light left the sky. Inside the kennel across the base, 8 dogs were finishing their evening routines, being settled by handlers who had learned to slow their breathing before they reached the gates, who had learned that certainty was a posture, before it was a feeling, who had learned, as Sutton had put it once, without drama, in the middle of the corridor on an ordinary Tuesday morning, that you didn't lead a dog by pulling on the leash. You led it by having somewhere worth going. It sounded simple. Most true things do.